really unpack the Christian distinctives here. How do we worship God in spirit and truth? And how do we worship him collectively or corporately? How do we worship him as a body as opposed to how we might worship him individually? And the way we do this collectively is going to be a little differently than the way we do it individually. In Hebrews, it talks about both of these things, but particularly it looks at how we can kind of individually offer up worship in Hebrews 13. And it says, beginning in verse 13, "Therefore let us go forth to him outside of the camp, bearing abuse for him. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city which is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruits of lips that acknowledge his name." And then it says, "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." This is a crucial turn, that when Jesus responds to the Samaritan woman, he tells her that the time is coming in which believers will sacrifice in spirit and in truth. And it's very clear from his response that there's not going to be just one place you can offer worship in the future. And this is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. In Malachi 1, verse 11, it talks about true sacrifice being offered from the rising of the sun to its setting, and the name of God being great among the Gentiles. So it's a twofold promise that in the New Testament, worship will happen all over the world. And second, it will be offered not just by Jews, but by Gentiles as well. And so we see this fulfilled in Christianity, both in the Eucharist and in the fact that every baptized Christian shares in the priesthood of Christ. That, so think about the word Christian. The word Christ, the Hebrew is Messiah, means anointed. And there were three offices that were anointed in the Old Testament: priest, prophet, and king. And so we participate in some sense by our baptism in the priesthood of Christ, in his kingship, and in his prophetic ministry. That doesn't mean, we can all predict the future, but it does mean that we speak on his behalf the truth about the world to the world. So even the word prophet, you're speaking for, the pro is for, you're speaking for God. You don't have to be revealing some new information the world's never heard before. It can just be you proclaiming the gospel. That's prophetic. And as you govern yourself and your family, as you govern your own passions, you're exercising something of this kingly or royal dimension as well. And the priesthood you offer when you offer sacrifices to him. And so Hebrews has just given us three ways to do that. Number one, the sacrifice of praise. So music ministry is all going to fall under that. But that's actually not the chief way that Hebrews envisions it. Rather, the chief sacrifice of praise is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. That when you inconvenience yourself to acknowledge you're God and I'm not, that's a way of acknowledging, giving God his worth, which is at the heart of worship, worthyship. You're giving God what's owed to him by acknowledging you are God, I'm not God. And then additionally, not neglecting to do good, sharing what you have. And then linked to this, he says, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So when you hear Catholics say, like, offer it up whenever you're struggling, this is an idea that you can take all of the daily events of life and turn them into acts of worship by offering them to God, because you are a sharer in the priesthood of Christ. Offer it up is something only a priest can do. And so when you tell, the mom struggling with 6 kids, offer up the difficulties of this season of life, you're invoking the fact that she shares in the priesthood of Christ. And this is something people maybe don't understand the theological underpinnings of it, but that's what's going on. We're acknowledging that there's a way that we can all offer worship, all offer sacrifice wherever we are and however we do that. When I help my neighbor, I'm sharing in this as well. When I sing, when I proclaim God for who he is. But then you ask, well, how do we do this collectively, right? Like, if that's how we worship individually, how do we worship collectively? Now, there's not just one answer to that question, but there is one answer par excellence. And that one answer par excellence is the Eucharist. And I would argue you see this most clearly in 1 Corinthians 10. St. Paul makes a threefold comparison. He looks at the way the Jews worshipped, he looks at the way the pagans worshipped demons, and then he looks at the way Christians worship. And the things that he points out are that they all have these sacrificial meals. And so you have what he calls the table of demons. That's the altar made to demons. And he contrasts this with the table of the Lord, which is the altar in a Christian church. And then he talks about how, they commune with demons by receiving this food sacrificed to demons. what's the parallel in Christianity? Because he says of the Jews as well, they become partakers of the altar by eating the sacrificial food. So what is the sacrificial food of Christianity is at the heart of Christian communal worship. And it's very obviously the Eucharist. And so St. Paul immediately after 1 Corinthians 10 goes into his explanation of the Eucharist in 1 Corinthians 11, and then into his explanation of the church as body in 1 Corinthians 12. And all of these pieces go together because as the body, we are united in the Eucharist. And this is an important dimension that we lose if we don't have a rich sacramental theology. That the common thread between Jews, pagans, and Christians is as you receive this sacrificial food, as you participate in this sacrifice, you are united in some way with the one to whom you're offering the sacrifice. And so he says, because we partake of the one loaf, the Eucharist, we are one body. In other words, the whole body of Christ thing in 1 Corinthians 12 flows out of the whole Eucharist thing in 1 Corinthians 11, and he tells us all that in 1 Corinthians 10, but so often people read 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 12 almost as if they're three separate books, unrelated, when they're actually a single argument that if you get Eucharistic theology, that makes sense both of what the Eucharist is, but also of what the church is. And these are inseparable, which is why I say that this is the worship that we, the church, give to God par excellence.
Yeah, when you were discussing that, something that came to my mind was a response that I've gotten a handful of times, especially in regards to the Eucharist as worship. And it's this idea of like, I've had people say, I can get behind the idea that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. But I don't know why we need a priest to do that. So their idea is, the early church was just house churches, and they were just like having this meal together, like praising God together. And then they do, what you do at Protestant churches, which is, you get the bread and the wine and, or grape juice and say what Jesus said. And like, why isn't that enough to make it that, if I believe it? What if I believe that it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity?
Okay, great. So at the heart of that question is this thing I kind of alluded to before, that the idea of priesthood and sacrifice are correlated. They are correlative. A priest is one who offers sacrifice. The person who offers sacrifice is a priest. And so then the question is, what kind of priest can offer the Eucharist? And we get that answer in the Last Supper, because there's a lot of stuff that Jesus has open to everybody, but the Last Supper he has for the apostles. And then he tells them, and not just everybody, do this. That do this is really critical, because what he says is, this is my body, this is my blood. And we talk about that a lot in terms of the real presence, that he really means the is. But the my is also really important. That the priest doesn't stand in the front of the church and say, this is Christ's body, this is Christ's blood. The priest stands in the person of Christ and says, this is my body, this is my blood. And he could never do that by his own authority. Father Smith can't just say, I'm going to call God down from heaven because I'm a baptized Christian. No, but he's been given the authority to do this with the phrase, do this. And that do this doesn't mean you and I have the ability to do that. And so even though there's this kind of stereotype of the early church being this really kind of loosey-goosey sort of place, we don't actually get any clear indication of that. I'm going to give you two resources from the first century that I think point in this direction. The first is the Didache. The Didache in chapter 14 talks about the Sunday worship of Christians. And it's a great resource because it talks about how they come together on the Lord's Day, which we know from other ancient texts is Sunday. And so we know Sunday worship is going on in the first century. And he talks about how you need to be reconciled before you come to the altar, that your sacrifice may not be profaned. And he uses the phrase that your sacrifice may be pure, that your sacrifice may not be profaned. And then he quotes Malachi 1:11, saying, for this is that which was spoken by the Lord, in every place and time offer to me a pure sacrifice. So that's three invocations in just the span of a few sentences in which the Christian common worship service on Sunday is described as a sacrifice. That is not some late development. That's not some medieval thing. We see that in the first century while the apostles are still alive. The other resource is the first letter of St. Clement, in probably the year 96 AD, in which he compares the structure of the church to the high priest, priests, and Levites and laity in the Old Covenant. So in that, it's not just everybody's at the same level, everybody's at the same authority. You clearly have bishops, priests, then called presbyters, we now say priest, and deacons and laity. That this threefold structure of clergy corresponds to the threefold structure of clergy in the New Covenant. And you have, in both cases, a royal and priestly people among the laity, but the fact that they're royal and priestly people doesn't mean that they share in the what we would call the sacerdotal nature of priestly ministry. There is something special about some people are actually called to share in a unique and special way. Now, this, by the way, was also foretold in the Old Covenant. In the last chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah 66, it talks about how these Gentile nations are going to come and offer true sacrifice, just like Malachi 1 does. And it says, some of them, meaning some of the Gentiles, I will choose as priests and Levites, says the Lord. That some has always struck me, because most forms of Protestant theology would say everybody's a priest or nobody's a priest. So if we talk about priesthood in the Christian context, the two standard responses are none of us are priests, only Christ is a priest, or everybody's a priest. But Isaiah 66 doesn't say all of them or none of them are going to be priests and Levites. Among the faithful Gentiles, it says some of them. So there's clearly a sense that within the community of the faithful of the New Covenant, there's a priesthood not shared by everybody. And what is that priesthood? Well, it's this Eucharistic sacrificial offering. That's at the heart of the priesthood, just as it's the heart of Christianity, I would argue more broadly. It's the heart of what makes the church the church. And again, this makes sense in light of the Old Testament. This makes sense in light of Old Testament priestly ministry as well. So, yeah, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I would say that's how we know. Oh, yeah, I guess if I can jump a little bit outside of the first century to the year 107, St. Ignatius of Antioch. He is a disciple of the Apostle John, and he's the bishop of Antioch, the place Christians are first called Christians. He's an extremely influential early Christian, and he learned Christianity from an actual member of the 12. And he talks about the threefold structure of bishop, presbyter, deacon. And he talks about this as being something that we don't have the authority to change, and how we need to have one Eucharist, one bishop. That you don't start having your own worship service apart from the bishop and trying to do your own thing. Like he's really clear on that not being possible. And he's even explicit that only the bishop and those priests that he delegates are able to offer the Eucharist. So all that's to say, the kind of myth of the house church where everybody kind of does whatever they want is mostly fiction. It's true, Christians sometimes met in house churches, but not because they thought that's the best place to meet, but because Christianity was outlawed.